Monterrey exploded into one of the most important battles in American history. For weeks, the volunteer army of Texans under Sam Houston's command had been harassed by the well-drilled troops of Mexican President Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. At San Jacinto, the chase ended. The generals met, and the Texans made their stand. 20 minutes of London glory that changed Texas forever. For 300 years, the court of Spain ruled an enormous empire which spread across North and South America. The New World was rich beyond dreams. In Mexico and Central America, Spanish culture rivaled the great courts of Europe. Spanish borderlands, settlements were primitive, few, and far between. By 1820, only about 3,500 Spanish citizens occupied the vast province called Tejas. In reality, the frontier belonged to ranchers, trappers, Indians, and adventurers. Spain wanted permanent settlers in the province to help civilize it. Since few Spanish citizens were willing to move to such a remote region, it was opened up to foreigners. In 1821, Moses Austin was given permission to bring 300 American families to Tejas. Similar permissions were soon given to others. About 200,000 acres of prime farmland was to be granted to settlers in Austin's colony. But Moses Austin died before he could see his dream fulfilled. It was up to his son, Stephen F. Austin, to carry out his plans. This was a time of great change around the world. Empires were crumbling, revolution was in the air. The people of Mexico rose up in revolt against the Spanish. They wanted the same liberties their American neighbors had won in 1776. And so in 1821, after years of fighting, Mexico won its independence. Tejas now became part of Mexico, and Stephen F. Austin's colonization contract needed confirmation from the new government. With that in mind, he set out for Mexico City.
I arrived without friends, ignorant of the language and the laws. I found the city in an unsettled state, the country still agitated by the revolution.
After 2 more years of political turmoil, Austin's contract was finally confirmed. The following year, the Mexican government adopted the Constitution of 1824. Modeled after the U.S. Constitution, it was widely endorsed by the citizens of Tejas. Then, a disturbing change. The Mexican Congress passed a law establishing a new province, Coahuila y Tejas. It combined Tejas with the neighboring province of Coahuila, where only a handful of American settlers lived. Saltillo in Coahuila, not Tejas, became the capital, and Tejas was given little representation in the provincial government. Still, at the time, these seemed small compromises in exchange for the rights the colonists now enjoyed under the laws of Mexico. Stephen F. Austin so welcomed his new government that he became fluent in the Spanish language and officially changed his first name to Esteban.
Este gobierno es el más generoso del mundo. En cambio, por ciudadanía americana y por conversión a la fe católica, El gobierno le concede a cada familia en exceso de 4.000 leguas de tierra, libre de derechos y contribuciones por 10 años.
By 1830, immigrants from the United States outnumbered native Mexicans in Tejas 4-1. Those numbers alarmed the Mexican government. And so, on April 6, 1830, the policy was changed, forbidding Americans and encouraging non-Americans to immigrate. The army was sent in to enforce the new laws. The era of goodwill between colonists and the Mexican government was ended. Rallies and calls for separate statehood within Mexico grew more and more common. In May of 1832, while protesting the actions of the Mexican commander, William Barrett Travis and Patrick Jack were arrested at Anahuac. This further fueled the fires of discontent. Meanwhile, in Mexico City, political unrest continued. Early in 1833, an ambitious general, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, became the new president of Mexico. He was arrogant and vain, calling himself the Napoleon of the West. Still, the Texans believed he was sympathetic to their cause. In April of 1833, they took a bold step. They drafted a petition demanding that Tejas be made a separate Mexican province, independent from Coahuila. An optimistic Stephen F. Austin took the petition to Santa Anna in Mexico City. Once again, he found the government in chaos. Receiving no reply to his petition, Austin vented his frustration in a letter home.
There is no doubt but that the fate of Texas depends upon itself and not upon this government. The country is lost if its inhabitants do not take its affairs into their own hands.
The letter fell into government hands. Austin was charged with treason, thrown into prison, and Coahuila y Tejas was placed under martial law. Santa Anna was disregarding the Constitution of 1824. He had become a dictator. In June of 1835, another skirmish in Anahuac brought Santa Anna's brother-in-law, General Martin Perfecto de Cos, marching into Tejas. That fall, when Stephen F. Austin finally returned home from prison, he was a changed man. The arrival of Cos and his troops in Tejas prompted a violent outburst against Santa Anna.
He is a base, unprincipled, bloody monster. War is our only resource. No halfway measures, but war in full.
During the second half of 1835, frequent skirmishes and confrontations heated up emotions on both sides to a fighting fury. Cos, commanding San Antonio, was attacked. On December 10th, 1835, after 5 days of fierce house-to-house fighting, he surrendered, and the Texans sent him and his men back to Mexico. Finally, in January of 1836, Santa Anna stormed into Tejas with an army of 6,000 recruits and seasoned veterans, intending to wipe out every shred of rebel resistance. The main Texan line of defense ran from San Antonio to Goliad. The Mexican forces headed to both of these points. General Urrea to La Bahia, Goliad, and Santa Anna to San Antonio. The first Mexican troops reached San Antonio on February 23rd. A determined band of fighting men, including Colonel William Travis, Jim Bowie, and Davy Crockett, retreated behind the walls of an abandoned mission at the edge of town, the Alamo. Santa Anna arrived on February 24th and demanded complete, unconditional surrender. Travis gave him an answer that became the rallying cry for the Texas Revolution.
The enemy has demanded surrender. I have answered the demand with a cannon shot, and our flag still waves proudly. I shall never surrender or retreat.
As Mexican soldiers streamed into San Antonio, a call to arms echoed across the land. Texas forever. Meanwhile, in a crude building in Washington on the Brazos River, elected delegates from all over Tejas met in convention. Despite all the talk of independence, Tejas had continued to support the Mexican Constitution of 1824. But the time for change was at hand. The delegates officially declared independence on March the 2nd, 1836, drafting and adopting a constitution, not for the province of Tejas, but for the Republic of Texas. They elected David G. Burnett, President of the Republic, and Lorenzo de Zavala, Vice President. Thomas J. Rusk was appointed Secretary of War, and Sam Houston, Commander-in-Chief of the Army. As a young man, Houston had served bravely under Andrew Jackson in the Creek-Indian Wars. President Jackson remained his close friend. Houston eventually became governor of Tennessee. But in 1829, his new marriage abruptly ended, and Houston left the governor's mansion a broken man. He'd come to Tejas looking for a chance to make a new start. As Commander-in-Chief, he'd found it. Houston left Washington and rode west toward Gonzales, hoping against hope that there'd be time enough to save the Alamo. There wasn't. The Alamo fell on March the 6th, 1836, after a brutal 13-day pounding. Its 189 defenders fought to the end. Between 600 and 1,000 Mexican soldiers died with them. Santa Anna viewed it as a glorious triumph. He confidently divided his army and pushed toward the east, threatening to drive every last rebel out of Texas. His plan was simple, but deadly. With all Texas settlements within about 100 miles of the Gulf Coast, 3 well-equipped Mexican forces could sweep Texas clean. The southern force would be 1,400 men under General Jose Francisco Urrea. Across the north, General Antonio Gaona was ordered to march with another 700 to Bastrop and Nacogdoches. General Joaquin Ramirez y Sesma, followed by Santa Anna himself, would drive on to Gonzales and then due east with 2,000 more. The Texas Army, caught in the middle, would be annihilated. Back in Gonzales with a few hundred disorganized troops, Houston learned the terrible news. The Alamo fallen, Travis's men butchered, the Mexicans on the march. He quickly made his decision. Fall back to the banks of the Colorado. Houston's weary men slogged east. They crossed the Colorado on March 19th and made camp on the other side. They were tired and hungry. It was high time to fight. Then came more bad news from the south near Goliad. The other Texas force, 400 well-armed men under James Fannin, had surrendered to Urrea following an all-day battle. Houston had once ordered a retreat to the Brazos. The Texas Army was at peak strength in the Colorado. Never again would it have so many men. As they retreated, men left in droves. Meanwhile, the new Texas government had left Washington and set out for Harrisburg, a safer, more central location. The panic grew. Settlers were leaving their homes and heading east as fast as they could in what became known as the Runaway Spring. The day after arriving at San Felipe on the Brazos, Houston turned his troops north to a point opposite Grosses Plantation. A week later, Santa Anna reached San Felipe. For reasons that may never be understood, he turned south to Richmond to cross the Brazos, a lucky break for the Texans. But the good fortune was short-lived. While camped at Grosses Plantation, bad news again caught up with Houston, once again from Goliad. Houston learned that on March 27th, Palm Sunday, Fennan's troops had been marched out of town. The men went quietly, thinking they were being released. But in fact, there were other plans. General Urrea and his troops were outraged at Santa Anna's orders and carried them out. Fannin and all but a handful of his men were massacred in cold blood. The execution broke all Mexican codes of military honor, and 350 more martyrs joined the men from the Alamo. Meanwhile, Santa Anna had reached the river crossing at Richmond. Although he knew that Houston's army was upriver, he elected to go after a bigger prize, the Texas government, just 30 miles away at Harrisburg. In particular, Santa Anna wanted to capture Vice President Lorenzo de Zavala, a former Mexican cabinet member and minister to France. Santa Anna felt he had the Texans on the run, and he was eager to put an end to the whole cold and miserable campaign. On April 14th, he made a fatal mistake. Taking only 750 men, he pushed well ahead of his main forces. Houston, meanwhile, was training and reorganizing his men. Across the river from Grosses, they had time to rest and room to practice maneuvers. Better still, two small cannon, nicknamed the Twin Sisters, arrived as they were leaving Grosses, a gift from the people of Cincinnati. But Houston's reluctance to fight was gnawing at his men. Open mutiny was a pistol shot away. Worse yet, he stubbornly refused to discuss his plans. On the evening of April 13th, they left Grosses and continued east, the men barely under his control. 3 days later, they reached a fateful fork in the road. A turn left would mean still another retreat. Turn right toward Harrisburg would indicate that the long-awaited battle was at hand.
We're going to Harrisburg! We're going back!
And so the Texas Army set out upon the right-hand road. Santa Anna was also on the move. On April 15th, he reached Harrisburg at 10 o'clock at night. The Texas government had left by steamboat at noon the same day. Furious, Santa Anna ordered the town burned to the ground. On the 17th, Mexican dragoons again came within a hair's breadth of capturing key members of the Texas government as it retreated from New Washington. But the Mexican commander, Colonel Juan Almonte, chivalrously ordered his troops to hold their fire when he spied President Burnett's wife in the fleeing boat. On the 18th, Santa Anna reached New Washington, while the Texas Army camped on the north side of Buffalo Bayou across from Harrisburg. There, Texas scouts intercepted a Mexican messenger with dispatches for Santa Anna. The Texans learned that Santa Anna was about to leave for Lynch's Ferry with less than 1,000 troops. This was the chance Houston had been waiting for, as even as the odds would ever be. He gathered his men together and delivered a stirring speech.
Victory is certain. Trust in God and fear not. The victims of the Alamo and the names of those who were murdered at Goliad cry out for vengeance.
On the 19th, the Texas Army took the road to Lynchburg. They marched all night, and just after dawn on the 20th, they took possession of Lynch's Ferry. At 8 o'clock that same morning, Santa Anna put the torch to New Washington and set off on the road to San Jacinto. Noticing increased Mexican scout activity, the Texans countermarched about a mile and occupied a dense wood. Behind them curved Buffalo Bayou. In front of them lay a peaceful prairie, a mile of grass as high as a man's knees. Hidden in a dense grove of oak trees, they waited. And shortly after noon, Santa Anna arrived. Santa Anna orders the lead company to drop its packs in place along the road. Forming a skirmish line, they move forward, probing the Texas position. The Mexicans fall back as the two sides exchange cannon fire. Sidney Sherman leads the Texas cavalry in an attempt to capture the Mexican gun. Santa Anna orders 3 companies of infantry out in support. The Texans fall back into their camp. The skirmish ends as quickly as it began. Sam Houston still isn't ready to fight, but the Texas soldiers are eager for battle. They're defending their homeland and their families. Ever since joining the army, they've been retreating. They know that Santa Anna has killed or massacred every Texan unit he's met. Every Texas soldier knows he'll leave this field a victor, or he will not leave it at all. Against the advice of his officers, Santa Anna abandons the high ground and selects a campsite on a reverse slope with his back to the water. The Texas Army is camped on the opposite side of the field, about a mile away. The trees, tall grass, and a distinct rise of land keep the two armies hidden from each other. Darkness falls. Santa Anna works his troops through the night, building breastwork barricades from pack saddles and supply boxes. Houston sleeps soundly, well past dawn. April 21st, 1836, 9 a.m. After an all-night march, General Cos reaches the Mexican camp with 500 men. Santa Anna's force is now about 1,250. The Texans number about 900. 10 a.m. Houston details Erastus Deaf Smith, his most trusted scout, to destroy Vince's Bridge, delaying further Mexican reinforcements. 12 noon. Houston holds a council of war. For the first time, he asks for advice.
Shall we attack the enemy in position, or receive their attack in ours?
Surprisingly, most of the officers vote against an immediate attack. Houston says nothing. With no sign of enemy activity, Santa Anna tells the cavalry to water their horses and rest. Cos's men are asleep, their muskets stacked. the ultimate display of arrogance, no sentries are posted. 3:30. Houston's order comes, at last.
Parade and prepare for action.
The men fall in. On the Texans' extreme right is the cavalry under Mirabeau B. Lamar, a future president of the Republic. Next to them, Henry Millard's infantry, known as the Regulars. To their left and slightly ahead, the artillery with the twin sisters under George W. Hockley. Next to the cannoneers is Edward Burleson's 1st Regiment. And on the Texans' far left is the 2nd Regiment under Sidney Sherman's command, with the 9th Company made up entirely of Mexican Texans under Captain Juan Seguin. Across the prairie, the Mexican camp is enjoying a quiet afternoon. Santa Anna is in his tent. Houston turns his horse and lifts his sword high in the air.
Trail arms, forward!
The Texans move quietly forward. They form a long, thin line, 2 men deep, sweeping through the tall grass. On the Texas left, Sherman's men slip silently through the woods. On the right, Lamar's cavalry blocks the Mexicans' only line of escape. 4:30. The Mexicans are stunned. They hastily grab their muskets. The first Mexican shots sail right over the heads of the advancing Texans, who were aided by a distinct rise in the ground and the blinding light of the afternoon sun, which is shining directly in the Mexican's eyes. The Battle of San Jacinto is over. Sherman's 2nd Regiment attacks the Mexicans' right wing. The survivors on the Mexican right run down behind the barricade, creating even more confusion. The Mexicans never get their units formed up. Trained in Napoleonic tactics, they cannot fight effectively out of formation. The Texans are hand-to-hand fighters. This is their kind of battle. A Mexican general, Manuel Fernandez Castrillon, bravely tries to rally his troops, but they're wild with fear. He stands there, arms folded, glaring at the Texans, waiting for death. Lamar's men overwhelm the confused Mexican cavalry. Firing grape shot, the twin sisters are blasting holes in the Mexican breastplate, killing the men behind them. Burleson's 1st Regiment and Millard's Regulars swarm over the barricades, their rifles, muskets, pistols, tomahawks, and long knives raining down on them. The actual battle lasted barely 20 minutes, but the slaughter continued for an hour. Beaten back into a deep ball, Santa Anna's soldiers found themselves in a horrible death trap. Fighting for their lives, their families, and everything they owned, the Texans were in a frenzy of revenge. Finally, at sunset, the bloodbath ended. At night, the moon shone over a grisly scene. Mexican bodies 630 in all, lay scattered over the plain, in the woods, and in the water. More than 700 prisoners were taken. The cries of the wounded men and the sounds of wolves filled the night air. Surprisingly, only 2 Texans had been killed and 23 wounded. Across the bayou, De Zavala's home served as their hospital. Eventually, 7 more wounded died, bringing the Texas death toll to 9. The next day, more Mexicans were captured and brought into camp. The appearance of one man in particular caused a stir among the prisoners. It was Santa Anna. He was taken immediately before Houston.
I'm Antonio Lopez de Santana, President of Mexico, Commander-in-Chief of the Army, and I put myself at the disposition of the brave General Houston. I wish to be treated as a general should when a prisoner of war.
Both leaders knew that thousands of well-rested Mexican troops were just hours away. But Santa Anna feared for his life. Reluctantly, he agreed to prepare a dispatch, ordering his generals to retreat.
March back to San Antonio and wait orders, since I have agreed with General Houston upon an armistice, pending certain negotiations, which may put an end to war forever.
How should the dispatch be dated? The Mexicans asked. Lynchburg's the name of this place, Houston replied. No, sir, one of his men spoke up. It's called San Jacinto. But the Mexican Congress refused to recognize the new republic. 10 years later, when Texas became the 28th state of the American nation, war between the U.S. and Mexico was inevitable. An American victory in 1848 brought over 1 million square miles of territory into the United States, reaching across the Southwest to the Pacific Ocean. But the first mile of land was claimed right here, on the battlefield of San Jacinto. On a gentle rise of ground in front of Santa Anna's campsite stands a monument to that heroic afternoon in 1836. At its apex sits a 220-ton Texas star, the chosen symbol of the young republic. And at its heart rests a symbol of the courage of those determined men whose love of freedom and of Texas will live forever.